Hi everyone. Yeah, so I'm Nandini. I'm at ISER Tirupati, and in my lab we study squirrels, different kinds of squirrels. I'm going to talk to you about one part of the work we do. We work on palm squirrels. Palm squirrels, you all know what palm squirrels are. They're these common squirrels that you see around cities. Chennai has the three-striped palm squirrel. It's got three stripes, it's loud, it's visible. This is another palm squirrel in the Western Ghats. But I'm going to start talking to you a little bit about species traits and why they're of interest, and why as an evolutionary ecologist it's interesting to study something like this. Some of this material might be something you've already heard from the speakers in the morning, and if that's the case, don't hesitate to tell me that it's something you want to move ahead with or you know. Yeah? All right, so
just our repetition is good.
okay. Okay, all right. All right, so maybe this is something you've talked about already, yeah? Darwin's finches. You all know what Darwin's finches are. How do the Darwin's finches differ from each other?
Beak.
Yeah, so why is the beak important? Why is it different for each species? Right, so these seem to be some kind of adaptations or traits that have evolved for specific purposes, and that's kind of what I'd like to talk about today, right? So what is a trait? So traits are characteristics, and they can be of several kinds. You can have morphological traits like beaks. You can have behavioral traits like a dance that a bird does to attract a mate. You can have a physiological trait, which could be something like basal metabolic rate. That's a physiological trait. You can have a life history trait, which could be timing of reproduction, or you could have a genetic trait. So all of these in some ways are different kinds of traits. Whether an animal has a specific morphology or a specific behavior, whether it lives in a particular habitat, these could be traits, right? But what is interesting to us is traits that have evolved to provide some kind of adaptive advantage to a species, right? And it's a fallacy to think that every single characteristic or trait that you see is something that has evolved for a reason, or that it provides some kind of significance to that organism today. So for us, we are interested in studying traits that do confer some kind of fitness benefits to animals. And if I'm going too fast, please tell me I should slow down, right? So there are specific traits that confer advantages to animals, and these are traits that are passed down. So over generations, these traits will accumulate in a species through the process of natural selection. So you have adaptations, which are features that are produced by natural selection for a current function. And again, not all traits are adaptations. So examples are all around us. You have examples of camouflage, something like the cuttlefish, which blends into its surroundings. You have frogs in Alaska that freeze over winter. So this is an adaptation to put up with extreme temperatures that can go to -80. You have fish in the Antarctic that have antifreeze proteins in their blood that again are an adaptation to extreme cold. You have animals that can survive in extreme habitats like deserts without having to drink water. They can get nutrient water from, say, seeds or something that they eat, right? So there are different kinds of adaptations that we see all around us. But how does one know if a trait has particular adaptive significance today, right? So I'll walk you through a few examples, and some of these you might have heard before we get to the work that we do in my lab. So this is a pigeon. Most of you know what rock pigeons are. So rock pigeons have this curved tip on the beak, at the edge of the beak, right? Why do they have this? Does anybody know? Why would, like, not all birds have curved tips, right? Curved beak tips. So why would, say, this bird have a curved beak tip? To dig. What do pigeons eat? They eat insects, okay. Okay. What else do they eat? They're big birds, right? Seeds, grains, okay. So why would they need a tip like this? Is it related to what they eat? Can it be something else? Okay. But doesn't every bird need to do that? So none of the finches had these hooked beak tips, right? Or not very obviously.
As a bait.
As bait. Okay.
Bait.
Okay.
As in, for fish inside water.
Okay. Okay. So again, something related to feeding. Could it be a reason not related to feeding?
To carry post.
Sorry, but that's hilarious. Yeah, that's a great one. Yeah, to carry post. Absolutely. Yeah. All right. So these are the kinds of questions that, yeah, did you want to say something?
I just wanted to get this because they stopped building nests, but I'm not sure if they really build nests anytime in history.
They stopped building nests?
I don't know, like they live in buildings right now.
Yeah, so they don't build nests in buildings? But in Chennai, there are pigeons everywhere, rock pigeons, right? They sit on top of ACs, and do they build nests on ACs, or do they just sit on the ACs? They build nests, right? Small nests, I mean, like, not huge nests, but yeah, they definitely still do build nests. But these are the kinds of things we want to ask, right? Why does this bird have a curved beak tip, right? And a couple of scientists came up with the idea that maybe it's to remove lice, right? Maybe it's not related to feeding, because these birds, pigeons as a family, feed on fruits and insects maybe, but seeds, but very frugivorous. So why do they need such curved tips, right? So these scientists came up with the idea that these rock pigeons have a lot of lice, and maybe the tip helps them to remove lice. So is it possible that this is why rock pigeons have curved beaks, right? How would you answer such a question? And I'll walk you through a few examples before we come up with our own. As an experiment, what they did was they took a few birds and they kept some birds with the beaks intact, and they cut off the beak tips of some other birds, right? They then exposed these birds to lice, and allowed some of the cut beak birds to regrow their beak tips, right? And looked for what the lice infestation was like. And what does the data suggest? What do you think?
Apparently, yes. The triangle was, the curve was going up, peaking somewhere, and then the number of lice
Comes down, right? Yeah. So what does that seem to suggest?
At that point, the beak has started growing again, and the bird has been able to move.
Yeah. So maybe beaks do. I mean, the tips, the curved tips on the beaks do play some kind of role and help to control lice, because the birds that were allowed to regrow their tips seem to have lower numbers of lice than the ones where the tips were cut off, right? So this is an experimental way in which we can look at an adaptation and test to see if there is a function that is attached to it. And lice will affect quality of the body, which will affect fitness, which will probably affect reproductive success, and therefore is probably an important trait. So there are several other ways in which, yeah.
Do all the rock pigeons have the home kind of look? Do all rock pigeons have?
Sure, yeah. So we're talking about species traits. There might be variation within a species, and some might have more pronounced hooks than others, some individuals, but yes, we're talking about a trait that seems to be constant or fixed or present across a species, right? So this is another example. You have flowers that have some kinds of patterns close to where you find the pollen and the nectar. So these are called guides, and why would these be present on flowers? This is basic botany, pollination, biology. What do you think? To guide insects, yeah? Yeah, so to direct insects, right? And how could you test to see if this is something that actually plays a role in, whatever your hypothesis is, that it guides insects towards the pollen? It should be quite easy to conduct an experiment to test this, right? Remove the patterns, right? So you can just paint over it and block the patterns for some flowers and let some flowers have the patterns and see what happens. This is, you have an experimental setup and a control setup, and you can even modify your experiment with different numbers of patterns. You can ask more refined levels of questions about why you need so many different kinds of stripes. Is one stripe enough? 2 stripes? You need 6 stripes on a flower to actually have it perform this function. So yeah, people conduct experiments, and this example, they use ink to fill in certain white patches or all white patches and look to see what happened, right? And they did find, yeah, sure.
Have they done the other kind of experiment where they have drawn the patches and
You mean added more, like given it 12?
Flowers where there no patterns exist, draw the patches and see that there is more pollination.
You need to have pollinators that require a guide to start with.
So for instance, if you have a flower where there both of these variations exist, right? Some of these have this white patches, some of these don't.
In the same species?
In the same species.
Okay.
If you paint the white with purple and see a reduction in pollination, can you increase pollination by
adding white?
Or
I'm not sure.
because,
That's
I
an
can
interesting
always
question.
come up with a confounder saying that it's some kind of a spell that the paint was emitting which stopped the pollination.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you could. That is true. Which is why you need to make sure you have non-toxic paint or non.
Yeah, but I can never assure. I
That-
can never put this confounder apart unless I paint white and increase the pollination.
Yeah, so you can paint the white flowers also. So you can match the smell on both.
So I paint, I can do that as well. That I paint the white on white and see
Yeah.
that it does not
Yeah,
change.
so that you're
But I
keeping
need
the
to
smell
do-
constant.
I need to do at least one of them.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if people have artificially added stripes. Maybe that's something Dr. Geeta will know more than me.
I seem to remember an experiment in which actually they had a matching variation and I can't remember the species. So it does seem to work in nature.
No, I mean, the reasoning is compelling, but
Yeah.
I think, as to make an experiment.
Absolutely,
I
and
think it
absolutely,
still
you.
needs to be done.
Yeah, you would. That if you had a scenario with flowers like this, then yeah, that would strengthen your case for explaining that this is.
On some other part of the
No, what she's saying is you paint the white on the white. So you have to sense.
Smell.
so the smell.
If you're worried about the chemical
You're
signal.
worried about something.
Yeah.
I think usually they test it before, but I'm not sure. In this case.
The paint.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
I also heard somewhere that insects see in UV region of the electromagnetic spectrum.
Right.
So, that also.
Yeah, there might be UV signals surrounding the white, and that's something that people do look at. And you can make sure you block the UV signal as well as the white, or block only the white and leave the UV. You can do various combinations if you can establish beforehand that the flower has UV signals and white signals. So it just depends on your knowledge of your study system before you set up your experiment. And also your question, is the UV the adaptation you want to test, or is the white the adaptation, right? There's also, I'll get to it in a minute, but there's also some ways in which we can discount certain traits as being important in the current scenario, where we decide not to focus on them even if they are, conspicuous traits. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. Yeah? All right, so basically a trait or a set of traits that increases fitness of the animal or the plant that possesses it is called an adaptation, and these are adaptive traits when they confer advantages. So again, we determine what the trait is for, and we have to see that having that trait allows that individual. So we have to see that having that trait allows that individual to be more successful in terms of reproductive fitness, because in a Darwinian sense, this is the only currency that really matters, right? As long as it's able to leave more progeny behind, that trait is going to get passed down. So that trait has to confer increased fitness. So there are different ways in which we can determine whether traits are performing adaptive functions or not. And to me, this is very exciting. Before we go ahead and study these traits, it's really exciting to see if in today's scenario, this trait really confers some advantages. And there are different ways in which we can do this. Basically, there are three ways in which we can do this. One is by observational studies. One is by experimental studies like the ones we just talked about. Or there are phylogenetic studies that we can do where we compare across species. All right, one more example. We just talked about two experimental studies. We'll talk about one observational study, right? So you all know the difference between experiments and observations, right? And in ecology, it's not always easy to conduct experiments depending on the system that you work in, the landscape that you work in, the country that you work in. So we often resort to observational studies. So this is an example of a water buffalo with birds called oxpeckers on them. And you must have seen buffaloes with, say, egrets or mynas on them, right? So, and have you seen this commonly? You hear about this in school textbooks, right? Isn't it taught in, I don't know, 11th or 9th standard as, what is it taught to you as? Cattle egrets. What is this? Why are cattle egrets on cattle? It's a mutualism, right? Textbooks tell you this. It's a mutualism. And what is the mutualistic interaction here?
The egrets, they feed on the insects that come out when the buffaloes walk on the grass.
Okay, so how is it mutualistic? So the egrets are getting something, either the insects from the grass or the ticks from the buffalo. What are the buffalo getting? Oh, they're getting freed of the nuisance of the ticks, is it? Right, right. I mean, I'm just trying to understand.
But recently the cat egrets have been evolved to following the tractors more than the buffaloes.
Okay. Okay, that's a good observation.
Tractors create a lot of, they give more than the buffaloes.
Okay, so they get more food from tractors than they get from buffaloes, so they follow tractors instead of buffaloes. Okay, great. So do they sit on the tractors? Okay, all right. Okay, so yeah, so do you doubt that it's a mutualism then? Or do you think it is a mutualism? So what are the buffaloes doing? I mean, the poor buffaloes if the cattle egrets are gone. Sorry?
They're just eating grass.
Okay, they're just eating grass. Okay. So a few years back, a few scientists set out to question this very idea. You know, is this really a mutualism? This is like this textbook example. Everyone says it's like the bird, you know, getting rid of the ticks, and the buffaloes, you know, the ticks are getting rid of by the birds, and the birds are getting food from the buffalo as well. So they set out to test this. So how would you test this if you wanted to test something like this? What would you do?
Teeth should be removed from the buffalo.
Okay.
So that whether the birds were feeding on it, we can actually.
Okay, so if you remove the ticks from the buffalo,
They will not sit on it.
so then the birds should not come and sit on the buffaloes. Okay. So how do you show then, suppose the birds are not sitting on the buffalo, if the buffalo doesn't have ticks, how does that show you that it's beneficial to the buffalo to have the birds on it?
To prove not, it is a mutualism. It is not a mutual. To prove it is not
Mm-hmm.
So
Okay.
prevent the birds from coming there.
Okay.
See the growth of the ticks.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So you stop the birds from sitting on the buffalo and see how many ticks the buffaloes have, right? So the prediction is that the buffalo should have more ticks if there are no birds on them, and the buffaloes that have birds on them should be controlled, right? So is that going to answer your question about function of these birds and this kind of mutualistic relationship? Yeah. So a couple of people set out to do this, right? In 2000, the scientist called Weeks looked at this traditional explanation that said that oxpeckers, these birds in Africa that sit on water buffaloes, eat ticks, right? So he spent a whole year doing observations and looked for ticks in pellets of the birds, and he found ticks in the pellets of the birds, which shows that the birds are eating some ticks. They also seem to eat wax from the ears of the buffalo. They also seem to eat dead skin, and they licked the open wounds on the buffaloes, right? So this is all his observation of what the birds were doing on the buffaloes. And the traditional explanation is that they eat ticks, right? So he conducted an experiment, just like you said. He had two groups, one with ticks, buffalo with ticks and buffalo without ticks, counted ticks at the end. But since he saw these birds doing other things as well, he also measured the number of wounds, because birds were observed to lick open wounds, and he also measured the amount of ear wax in the buffaloes, right? Because the birds seem to do all this. And what did they find? All right, so they found no evidence for tick eating, right? That's the thing, first thing off the bat. So they found here you have the white is where you have birds, and the black is where you don't have birds, right? And they did 3 sets of experiments, and they found that where there were no birds, there were more ticks in the first case. Second case was not that, straightforward, didn't show you that pattern. Third case also showed you a strange pattern, right? So no clear evidence that the birds were eating ticks, right, from all 3 experiments. So you can't conclusively say that the birds are really performing this function of eating ticks, right? Then he looked at the earwax, and here he finds that wherever there was no bird, the cow or the rhino or whatever, the water buffalo, had much more earwax, right? So maybe they are performing a function not with respect to ticks, but with respect to earwax, right? But they also found that the cows with the birds had more open sores, so they had more open wounds, right? So what are the birds actually doing on the cows or on these buffalo? And an experiment like this really goes to test, an idea that we have. Can you say for sure that birds are performing this function of tick eating? No, not really, right? And they performed the same experiment with rhinos, because rhinos also have birds sitting on them, and they found very similar results. There was no decrease in ticks because of birds, right? So in some sense, the birds are, just using the buffalo. Maybe the biggest service they're giving them is removing earwax, but they seem to be opening wounds on the cows, right? So is this really then a trait or a behavior that has evolved to confer some kind of advantage? We need to rethink some of our ideas, right? So they seem to be vampires, eaters of earwax, and when they do eat ticks, they prefer adult female ticks that are full of blood, which means these ticks have already done their damage to the host, so the buffalo is not really gaining that much. So they do eat some levels of ticks, but they're definitely causing more parasitism to the buffaloes than a mutualistic kind of reaction, right? So basically what we're trying to say is that when you see a behavior or a trait, you can't accept a folklore or a myth about its adaptive significance, because this is something you've heard. School textbooks should not be, using these examples without citing scientific studies. And we should subject our hypotheses to testing, right? So again, not every adaptation is a trait, and not every adaptation is perfect, right? It's not always a win-win situation. And there can be differences across species or populations, which are not always adaptive. All right, so coming back to how we can study adaptations, we've looked at two ways. You have experiments, which are the most powerful because they allow you to control certain factors, right? Like control the ticks or, control the color on the flowers. And you can isolate single factors and test just that, which is what a good study should do. And that's the most important thing when you're investigating a single trait. You can also do observational studies and look at field observations to look for patterns, right? I'm not going into an explicit example of this, but there are several examples where we've studied behavior, especially with respect to field observations. The third is also interesting. It's when you use a phylogenetic comparative method to look for the evolution of an adaptation. And I'm not sure if that's something that was covered earlier today. Was it? Just one example, okay. All right, so we'll go through a couple of examples. What do you mean by comparative study? I'm sure you heard about phylogenies. You know how phylogenies are built, right? Phylogeny is a relationship between, or depicts a relationship between closely related species. And sometimes we can use questions or a setup like this to answer a question. So let's assume that our question is this. We're looking at bats, and some species of bats have bigger testes than other species, right? So why is this so? And males in some of these have larger testes for their body size than others, right? And the hypothesis is that larger testes are an adaptation for sperm competition. This is a study that was proposed in the late 90s. So what you had was, these are social species. These bats are live in groups, and sperm competition is when multiple males will mate with a female, and there is competition between the sperm inside the female post-mating, right? So does larger testes allow for more reproductive success of a male? That's a simple question. And this is a question that's answered over and over again across animal systems. So look at a group size and look at testis size, and you should see a correlation. So you should see that, animals that live in larger groups should have more need to compete and therefore have larger testes, right? So this should be something that points towards the evolution of large testis size in male bats. But if we're looking at different species here, then the question here is, are each of these data points independent of each other, right? So, and by that, this is what we mean. All right, so if we're looking at, say, 6 species, right, and we're looking at one trait across 6 species, let's assume that our trait is still testis size and group size. So you have 6 bats, A to F, and when you plot them with group size against testis size, you see 3 clusters, right, A, B, C, and D, E, F. Then you look at a phylogeny of these 6 bats, and you find that A, B, C are clustered at one node, and D, E, F are clustered here, right? So in fact, you don't have 6 data points, you only have 2, right? Because from an evolutionary point of view, this relationship of testes and group size evolved here for A, B, and C, and this relationship of D, E, F evolved over here, right? So in some sense, if we consider patterns without taking into account history or evolutionary history, we might make erroneous conclusions about them being adaptations that are important in species today. So several of these traits might be things that have been passed down, that were under selection at some point of time in the past, but today none of these species are being actively governed by these traits. There's no increased reproductive success about this. So we use a method called phylogenetic independent contrast. This is only one of several methods that are out there. And so basically an independent contrast is looking at pairs of sister species, and you look to see how these pairs evolve away from their common ancestors. So we can go into this a little more if you're interested, but for now we can keep it simple. So a phylogenetic tree constructs distances between species and their common ancestors, right? So in some sense you're looking at contrasts between one species and a common ancestor. So you're looking at the difference that the trait M and N have compared to S, and so on and so forth, right? So in some sense you have 4 contrasts, not 6 species dots once you're done with analysis like this, right? So you're taking into account relatedness between species and distance of relationships. This is usually time, but we can convert it to a branch length. So if you did analysis like this, you would see that you have, this is the paper that did the analysis of all the bats. They saw that body mass and testis size, after they took into account group size, still showed you patterns, which showed that testis size is larger when group size is larger, right? So in some sense, this is a result that shows that it's a pattern that seems to have evolved irrespective of phylogeny, and that seems to hold today, right? Some of these concepts might be a little complicated, but we can talk about them a little more if you want. Another way you can use a phylogeny to understand a pattern is when you're looking at something like a discrete trait. So this is some of the work that I've done in the past. I studied flying squirrels. And flying squirrels are one of many different kinds of species of squirrels. There are 280 squirrels across the world, and they occur in different life forms or lifestyles, as we call them. So the ones you see around here are tree squirrels. Then you have ground squirrels that live on the ground and underground in extreme environments that are usually quite cold. And then you have flying squirrels that are nocturnal. They come out at night and they glide between tree to tree. And they are found in forests all over the Western Ghats and the Old World, right? So in most mammals, females are smaller than males, like humans or lions or primates, right? Female body size is smaller than male body size. But in flying squirrels, females are larger than males, which makes them an oddity amongst mammals. And the interest was to ask why. They're also one of the very few groups of mammals that glide as a major means of locomotion. So they don't fly like bats, but they glide. And there are only 4 other groups of mammals that glide anywhere in the world. So are they females greater than males because of some aerodynamic related advantage? And the hypothesis that I was testing was something called the big mother hypothesis, which is that when animals live in 3-dimensional environments, females, mammals, incur a cost when they get pregnant because they put on a lot of their body mass during pregnancy. So locomotion with this excess body mass is energy intensive. And so you have a larger skeletal frame to begin with to compensate for the excess weight gained, right? So this was a hypothesis that I was trying to test. But the first thing to do, since flying squirrels are squirrels, was to see if only flying squirrels were female biased in size, and that's what it's called when females are bigger than males, or if all squirrels were female biased. So if all squirrels were female biased, it would not make sense to ask this question about gliding, right? You have to be able to show that only gliders have females that are larger than males. That's your first point before you can conduct experiments to look for the adaptive significance of large female size. Yeah, is everybody with me till now? Yeah? So you construct a phylogeny, and this was constructed based on genetic sequences of squirrels that were available in a global database, and looking to see if you can map your trait. So the trait here is reversed sexual size dimorphism or female biased size. So you map your trait across this tree, and here pink is female bias and yellow is male bias, right? So pink is larger females, yellow is larger males. And these branches, these are all genera, and the branches that have pink have females larger than males, right? But what you see is that this is flying squirrels up till here, But you see that not only flying squirrels are female biased, you see these pink branches showing up in a few other places along the tree. You also interestingly see that the ancestral or the most basal group of squirrels, which are the giant squirrels, which are tree squirrels, have female bias. So are we justified in asking this question related to gliding? Because if your ancestral squirrel was female bias, then maybe flying squirrels have just carried that trait down in evolutionary time. And maybe the male biased squirrels are the ones who have evolved specific male bias. So I shouldn't be looking at female bias, I should be looking at male bias, right? However, there was enough evidence to show that most flying squirrels are female biased. This yellow here is insufficient data. We eventually threw it out because it was just a few species that are not well known. The ancestor here, tree squirrels, also seem to be female biased. And that is a study by itself. We think that that's not an ancestral trait, that is a trait that has reappeared across tree squirrels. And it's difficult to tease these apart, but this is what we mean when we say it's important to take into account evolutionary relationships, right? So we did go ahead and look at female bias in flying squirrels, and we found strong scaling patterns. Yes?
So, just looking at this, it seems like female bias could be ancestral in this state down here, right?
This is flying squirrels, yes.
Yeah. And also in if the root you can't resolve, so it should be in the other lineages as well.
Yeah, so this is poor data. I mean, we did a lot of investigation here, and we find 1:1 ratios, not really female bias. So we went ahead and looked at this in good detail because it would have really thrown everything. These we think are species that have evolved female bias for specific reasons. This is a group of chipmunks where they survive in extreme conditions. Females are larger than males, but males compete through running races. They're ground squirrels that live in meadows, and males will fight each other to the death to mate with females, but competition is with aerodynamics of running. So we think that males have evolved smaller size for aerodynamic advantages of sexual displays. So yeah, I mean, it's not always easy to tease these patterns apart, but we did find that there were advantages for large female size with respect to size of litter within this group, and that's not work that I'm presenting now. So yeah, so we say that these traits have evolved through natural selection and confer fitness. We can measure these in the field, fitness as number of young, number of reproductive bouts, reproductive success, or with genotypes looking across populations. This is something you might have heard. When traits are selected and acted upon by natural selection because of a particular reason, you have a normal distribution in a population that can shift, and it can shift in one direction or another, and you have directional selection. You can have situations like this, and I believe you've heard this in the morning, right? When we talked about, or somebody has talked about, no? So with directional selection, you have a trait that changes over time for a certain reason. It is being selected upon because of a new environment, a new pressure, a new selection pressure. And you have the original population then shifting to a new peak, right? So this is a direction of selection. This can happen like in the case of your moths, the light moths and the dark moth. You had an original population which was comprised more of light moths than dark moths, and then later, because of industrial revolution, there was natural selection for a darker phenotype, right? So your population curve shifts to the right. You can also have selection that works to stabilize a particular trait when for some reason, say, birds of small beaks and large beaks are selected against, and maybe there is suddenly only a food type that is available and best eaten by birds with middle-sized beaks, and your population can shrink, where only these birds The middle-sized beaks have high fitness, and so you have a stabilizing kind of pressure. The third is when you have disruptive selection, and again, for some reason, maybe because of some natural scenarios, plants that are best eaten by this sized beak animal disappear, and you have small plants and large plants. You might have selection that favors small and large beaks, and you might have a new peak in the population like this, right? And this is all well, great for theory, but does this happen in real life, right? Is this something we can see around us? Is this something we have to wait to see, after 1 million years? And is this just, textbook material? So what I'd like to say now is I'd like to shift gears a bit. The world we're living in today is changing rapidly, right? All of you know about climate change. All of you know about pressures that humans are putting on the earth. And we know how ecosystems are changing, right? And this is a map of climate sensitivity, just for you to realize that India is way high up there, right? We're, not comfortable or an easy landscape. So this is the reality of what's happening. And with a changing world, you have changing resources, changing pressures, and species are constantly responding to these changes around us, right? So a classic example of climate change and impacts on species is the polar bear, and how the ice is melting, and therefore polar bear populations are splitting into isolated populations. So the overall scenario is really bad for polar bears, and that polar bears are going to go extinct. We're not really going to see them a few hundred years from now. But if you look at populations of polar bears, you see that there are certain populations that are actually increasing in number, certain that are decreasing, and certain that are stable, right? So within a species, there are different pressures that act at micro levels that affect populations. Other examples, again, we come back to the Darwin's finches. Species are constantly trying to adapt to conditions around them, whatever these conditions might be, right? There's a long-term study on Darwin's finches, and it's a fabulous piece of work by Peter Grant and Rosemary Grant for the last, say, 60 years, 50 years. But they've studied these finches on the Galapagos Islands since the 70s, right? And soon into their study, there was a really bad drought at the end of the 70s, and a number of food plants on some of these islands vanished. And some part of their study was looking at beak size. And as they measured beak size, they saw that at some point, beak size became really large. The small beaked birds within a species could not survive because the food plants disappeared. And you see a shift in beak size in 30 years' time, right? So this is directional selection in action, like right now, all around us. And this is a remarkable study of evolution in action. And since then, we've seen many, many examples of this happening all around us. Does it take 50 years? Maybe not. Yes. Please.
Why are the standard deviations larger in the more recent times?
I'm not sure, but
You would more likely to have more data here, right?
yeah, maybe that is why. Maybe
But
the
that will stimulate interest for standard error. I don't know what they're measuring.
yeah, I'm not sure why the deviations are higher. I can look it up, but
Is this something happening in more recent times, which
maybe.
fluctuates?
Maybe these are recent climatic events that are causing fluctuations. I'm not sure.
It could be big sizes were fairly uniform, and because they're being driven down, there is a greater variation. Some beaks still remain big.
It could also be that populations are growing. This must have been a bottleneck with a lot of animals dying, and therefore, low standard deviation around beaks. And with increasing population sizes, you might see more error.
More variation in the
Yeah, more variation. Might be that.
But that means that there is no advantage per se. I mean, everybody is doing equally good.
Everybody is doing
I mean,
equally
whatever the
good.
big size is, you are still doing good.
Well,
The mean has stabilized over there. But even if you have a bigger or a smaller beak, you are not done.
we're not looking at fitness and beak size in this graph. We're just looking at mean beak size, what is present on the island. We're just showing that, or this graph just shows that mean beak size
So
itself
there
has shifted.
are survivors with
Some variation,
large
yeah, yeah.
But as well, I think if I remember, there's some of the plants come back.
Some other plants maybe do come back, and
I think some islands are.
yeah. But nevertheless, this is a remarkable study in how it shows us that evolution can happen in such small windows of time, like 30 years, and this is not something we ever imagined we would see in our lifetimes, right? And since then, there are several studies that show evolution or microevolution that happens at these time scales. Something that we see over and over again is range shifts. So if you say that species are adapted to living in certain conditions, and maybe Robin will talk more about this, species on certain mountains are evolved to live at certain altitudes or in certain climatic regimes. What happens with global climate change? And when habitats on these mountains are changing. So you have lowland habitats moving higher up the mountains and high elevation habitats disappearing or shrinking on the mountains. What happens to species that live in these habitats? And we see that there are largely three patterns, right? There's a species pattern of expansion. Some species do really well and can expand their ranges. Some species contract their ranges, either stay in the low elevation or contract in the high elevation. That is the more common pattern. And some species don't seem to be affected at all, right? So species constantly respond, whether it's a response that is detrimental to them or seemingly advantageous to that population, or maybe some species are really resilient, right? So in my lab, we're working on two systems, and I will talk to you about some of this work very briefly. So we work in the Ladakh landscape, and we work in a landscape that is extremely cold, where we study two groups of mammals. One is marmots, this is a marmot. Marmots are ground squirrels. They're really big, 6 to 7 kilos, look like a little dog, and really uniquely adapted to this cold because they hibernate in winters. So they can't stay awake or up above ground beyond September. They can't come up before April. Right? So these extreme cold temperatures, minus 40 centigrade, and feet of snow are not conditions that they can tolerate. And the behavioral adaptation that they have evolved is hibernation to deal with this cold, right? We also have pikas in the same exact landscape. Pikas are in the rabbit family. They're really small animals. The previous picture was of a pika. And they live in the exact same landscape, the exact same meadows, but pikas stay out all winter. Right? So they often share the same burrows, marmots and pikas. Marmots are gone by September, pikas are up throughout the winter. But they have very different kind of strategies, life histories. They breed maybe 3 times in a year, they collect hay, they live in social groups, activity periods change. So a large part of what we do is trying to understand how species can follow different strategies in the exact same landscape. I'm not going to talk about the work in the Ladakh landscape today. I'm instead going to talk to you about some work that we're doing on palm squirrels. We started with working in the Western Ghats, and we have now expanded this work all the way to the Tirupati landscape, maybe even to Bangalore and Chennai. So a little bit about what we do. So this is the first question we started with. Palm squirrels, this 3-striped palm squirrel is a lowland species. It's found in the southern part of India, South India, all the way to central India, and then it's replaced by the 5-striped palm squirrel in the north, in Delhi, and landscapes maybe from Madhya Pradesh onwards. So our question is, this lowland animal is typically found up to 800 meters along mountains, but in recent years we have seen it at high elevations in Kodaikanal. So the basic question we started with was, is a low elevation squirrel moving upward? And how does it do this? Is it using human landscapes? So these are the two things that we are working on. So we started working on the Kodaikanal plateau, which is 2,000 meters average elevation. We started doing some preliminary work there a few years ago, and we realized the 3-striped palm squirrel is all over Kodaikanal. And it shouldn't be here. This is 2,000 meters. It's not at this elevation anywhere else in the Western Ghats. So is it all over the plateau? Is it only in Kodaikanal town? So what is this? What is the history of this landscape? So in the 1970s, this is what the Kodaikanal landscape looked like. This is work from Robin's lab. So where they studied landscape change. So the light green is grassland and the dark green is forest. The pink dots are timber plantations. So in the 70s, it was mostly grassland, large stretches of grassland connected by small patches of timber, small patches of shola forest with very little timber. 50 years forward, and we have almost no grassland left, and it's almost all timber, right? So this timber has exploded all over the place. There are people and there is timber, right? So there's very little grassland. So this is really bad for grassland species, and he will tell you this. But what about an animal that requires trees to move? Is this a good thing for an animal? And does it allow such an animal to quickly adapt to a landscape that it was not able to adapt to earlier? That was the question that we set out to ask. So we set out to map where the squirrel was found. Is it found in all wooded landscapes, or is it found in specific parts of this plateau? And we found, to our surprise, that it was only found where humans are found, right? And for us, this was a really big finding, that this animal, so all of this light green is timber. So there is extensive wooded habitat and tree cover across this landscape. But this animal seems to be found and seems to nest only either in villages or outside villages in agricultural land, right? So this sparked off a much larger study where we started looking not just at this animal, but at other animals as well. So we, because we saw these animals only here, yeah.
Buffalo gets pretty cold in the winter.
Absolutely, exactly.
That they are seeking the warmth of human fires.
Exactly what we asked. So we set out to look to see where they nest. So small mammals like squirrels have to go back to a nest every single night. They can't sleep out in the open amongst leaves or on branches like birds. They have to sleep in a nest. So where are these nests built? We went and mapped nests. We are following 120 nests right now for 3 years. We find that we find nests only in human habitations. 98% of these nests are on buildings or inside buildings, right? And we've done extensive surveys across this landscape, and we find no sign of these animals in timber or in shola forest even. We then looked at what these nests are made of, and we find that these animals seem to be using a high number of artificial materials for the nests. So out of 19 materials that we documented from the nest, 12 are artificial, right? And by artificial, we mean human hair, jute thread, polythene bag, sari, cotton threads, banana fibers, and bananas don't grow native, cloth pieces. Of course, you do have grass and lichen and roots, tree bark, but you also have plastic threads. You have, a number of materials that they're getting from humans. So these animals are adapting extremely fast to this landscape. What makes everything more exciting is that we have talked to villages across this landscape, and we have dated villages that say we first saw this animal here in 1980, we saw it in 1990, in 2000, all the way to a site on the west where we have seen this animal for the first time this 1 year ago, right? So it does look like these animals are colonizing this landscape in a very rapid fashion and using humans to do this. So we looked at the other squirrels that live in this landscape, and there are giant squirrels, Ratufa, and the dusky squirrel, which is also in the same genus, but a really small habitat specialist that lives in shola forest. And we find very different trends. The giant squirrel lives inside forests and uses timber plantations extensively, does not use humans, and the same is true for this, does not use timber extensively either. So it doesn't seem to be something that is pervasive across all squirrels. It is something that this one species seems to be very good at doing.
Squirrels also, they're normally located.
No, they are native to the high elevation forests. So both of them occur in shola forests, and they are found in shola forests but venture out into timber. They never venture into human landscapes though. So this caused us to look at the genus of palm squirrels in general. We're looking at 3 species that are found in India, and now we've expanded the work to the 4th, which is in North India as well. So this is the 3-striped palm squirrel that's in Chennai. This is a species that's found along the Western Ghats, and this is the dusky striped squirrel that I was talking to you about. When we look to see, we found 4 locations where we think there might be some kind of movement going on, and I won't get into that right now. But when we look at these species, we see that they might occur in places with very different kind of precipitation and temperature regimes, right? So 2 of these require wet, humid forests. One of these, the one here, is a generalist and it's found in a wide variety of temperatures and rainfall regimes. Again, we see east-west movement, and I'm not going to go into this, but some of the traits we're looking at is that there seem to be 2 traits that are really important in squirrel systems. One is color and one is acoustics, right? Squirrels are distinct in how they look. They are also extremely vocal. So we think that all of this movement is causing species to come in contact with each other in much more ways than in the past. So when we look at a squirrel, is it easy for us to categorize it into species A, B, or C? Not so easy, it turns out. So we have a WhatsApp group and several groups on campus where we get people to send us photos from wherever they live, and we've categorized species on how they look, and we find that there is a very strong gradient, and it's not complete, species A versus B. There's a lot of ground for confusion. So we went to museums, and we're looking to see if there are specific patterns of color across species as well as within species, right? So theory predicts that darker species are in wetter, humid rainforest habitats, and lighter species are in lighter habitats. And this is camouflage advantage. So in the lab right now, we're doing a series of experiments to look for predation, to look to see if macro environmental variables correlate with color, and to look for genetic markers of color. So this is something we're looking at. Preliminary work seems to show that there are latitudinal patterns of color with darker animals in the south and lighter animals in the north for one species. But is this true across many species? We don't really know. We also see differences between the sexes, which is something that is very, very distinct for mammals, right? So yeah, we're looking at color in a large way to see if coat color is an adaptive trait within this genus of palm squirrels. We are also looking at body size, and we see that there's some differences across species, but not considerable differences, which only adds to the confusion to say that it's not easy to tell species apart in the field. The second direction that we're looking at in the lab, we're spending a lot of time looking at acoustics. Squirrels call a lot. They call every single day, multiple times a day, but also specifically during mating seasons, right? So we've categorized different kinds of calls, and we look to see why squirrels call. There are alarm calls, but there are also communication or affiliative calls. So when we look at variation in calls, so again, we want to know if acoustics are a means for squirrels to identify each other, if calling is a trait or is it a signal for one within a species or across species, right? Can they recognize their own species? Can they recognize another species, right? So for the palm squirrel, we looked at 3 populations, Tirupati, Chennai, and Kodaikanal, and we did some basic patterns to see if they all sound the same everywhere, and we see that they don't. So Kodaikanal is distinctly different from Chennai and Tirupati to start with, and again, this has led to more questions about whether this is because Chennai and Tirupati are close to each other geographically and Kodaikanal is different. So we are expanding our database to look more at patterns of calling, not just in India, but also in Sri Lanka. All right, so across 3 species though, we see that the 3 species have very distinct calls. So species traits, or if calling is a signal for a species, then one species should recognize only its own species, not another species, because these 3 species call very differently, right? So we conducted an experiment. We did some playback, again in 3 sites where we looked at, we played back the call from that location, and 3 other locations, and from a second species, right? And the short summary is that we find that they only seem to recognize their own species, and they best recognize individuals from the same location. So there are strong signals of calling. So can we establish that acoustics is an important trait? We really hope to get to that point in the next year or two. Can we establish that color is an important trait? Yes, we think it is, but again, we need another year or two before we can say these things. Once we have established that these are traits, we can look to see what happens when species move rapidly up mountains or across landscapes and encounter other species who have very similar signals. So then what happens? Do they get confused, or does that never happen? Yeah.
Trials in which you get a response, or something?
Yes.
So what is the second one is trial, and what happens?
So
100% response?
So here we do pre-trial, post-trial, and trial response. So these were all played back in Tirupati. So this is Chennai individuals played back to Tirupati. This is no response. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, this is no response. So Tirupati individuals responded most to Tirupati individuals, and pink. Yeah.
But the response is only 20%. Is that the median? This is the box which
Yeah, this is a box-Whitaker plot. This is the trial response. This is about 20%, yeah. Actually, they did, and I'm not sure why this graph doesn't seem to show it clearly. But the summary is that they did respond only to Tirupati individuals the most, but they seem to show agonistic interactions to another species. So they did not respond in an affiliative manner. Speaker experiments. Yeah, not great speakers, so we still have a lot of fine-tuning to do. So yeah, we have a lot of questions that we want to ask with a system as simple as palm squirrels and as common as palm squirrels. We are now extending some of the work to urban setups like Chennai, because we think that populations explode in urban scenarios, and we want to know why. We think these species adapt rapidly, and we're trying to see how. Yeah, so yeah, thank you, and I'm happy to talk about work later. That's an interesting question. We do think there's a pattern. We don't think it's road linked. We think it is human settlement linked. But settlements are along roads for the most part. So yes, it is about access to whatever resources they're looking for. We're still not sure if it's food or shelter.
And the other thing is, I'm not sure how much of the climatic predictions really work, especially for the eastern flanks.
Yeah.
Because eastern flanks are actually quite dry.
Yeah.
So that might actually support more colonizations.
Yes, that is true, except that the winters are very cold. So how do they survive the winters? So yes, the eastern part is very dry, and Kodaikanal is like an easternmost spur of the Western Ghats. So it is exceptionally dry even compared to other eastern slopes. But it still gets very cold, and they have extreme frost almost once a year. So how do these animals survive through these conditions?